I'll be back.
When the headline first went around, it sounded like something out of a bad monster movie. Florida, the state that already gave the internet alligators wrestling pool noodles and men fighting over parking spots with fists in the air, was reportedly turning loose thousands of snake-killing creatures into the wild on purpose. Comment sections lit up instantly. People joked that this was how horror movies start. Someone compared it to releasing mongooses on a tropical island and waiting for the inevitable ecological disaster. Late-night hosts got a punchline out of it. And for a few weeks, Florida releases Snake Army became one of those internet jokes that everybody repeated without actually reading past the headline. But here's the thing about Florida and its snakes. The joke and the reality are almost never the same story. And this time the real one is stranger, smarter, and far more consequential than anything the punchlines gave it credit for. Today we're pulling apart the actual program behind the meme, tracing it back to where it started, and showing you exactly why a state famous for chaos ended up building one of the most quietly impressive wildlife operations in the country. To understand why Florida would do something that sounds this outlandish, you have to go back to the real monster in this story. And it isn't the creatures being released. It's the Burmese python, a snake that was never supposed to be slithering through subtropical wetlands 9,000 kilometers from its native range in Southeast Asia. Burmese pythons started showing up in the Everglades in the late 1970s, and for a long time nobody took it seriously. A handful of escaped or released pets here and there seemed like a curiosity, not a crisis. The exotic pet trade had made these snakes wildly popular. They were cheap, dramatic-looking, and marketed as manageable. What the pet stores didn't advertise quite as loudly was that a Burmese python hatchling roughly the length of a pencil can grow into an animal stretching 16, 18, even 20 feet long, thick as a fire hose, weighing well over 100 pounds. Plenty of owners realized too late that they were sharing their home with something closer to a small alligator than a house pet, and South Florida's swampy, humid, prey-rich landscape turned out to be almost a perfect stand-in for the python's native habitat. Snakes that were released or escaped didn't just survive. They thrived. By the 2000s, the Everglades had a full-blown, self-sustaining python population, and the math behind that population is genuinely staggering. A single female Burmese python can lay between 50 and 100 eggs in a clutch, and she can do that year after year. There are no natural predators in the Everglades built to handle an apex constrictor of this size, so almost nothing was checking their numbers. Researchers eventually started comparing camera trap data and small mammal surveys from before and after the python invasion, and the results were brutal. Populations of raccoons, opossums, and rabbits in the hardest-hit areas of the park had collapsed by well over 90%. Bobcat sightings dropped off a cliff. Marsh rabbits functionally disappeared from large stretches of habitat where they used to be common. Wading birds, deer fawns, even full-grown white-tailed deer started turning up as python meals. In one now infamous case, biologists found a python that had swallowed a 7 to 7-pound deer, a meal that was something like 70% of the snake's own body weight, roughly equivalent to a grown adult swallowing a small refrigerator whole. This wasn't an invasive species nibbling around the edges of an ecosystem. It was an apex predator quietly eating an ecosystem from the inside out, and by the time most people outside Florida had even heard the word python problem, the snakes already had a multi-decade head start. Florida's first response was about as straightforward as it gets: pay people to go find them and remove them. Starting in 2017, the South Florida Water Management District began contracting a small group of licensed hunters, and the state soon layered its own python action team on top of that through the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. These hunters get paid hourly, plus bonuses that scale with the size of the snake and whether it's carrying eggs, because a python that's about to lay 50 to 100 more eggs is worth stopping before it does. The state also runs the now famous Florida Python Challenge, an annual public competition where anyone with the right training can register, head into the swamp, and compete for cash prizes tied to how many pythons they bring in. It's part conservation initiative, part reality show, and it draws hunters from across the entire country every single year. Between all these programs combined, Wildlife officials have documented tens of thousands of pythons removed from Florida since record-keeping began, with milestones being hit again and again. The 1,000th capture in a single program, then 5,000 total removed statewide, and eventually a jaw-dropping 20 tons, 40,000 pounds, of python biomass pulled out of just a 200-square-mile stretch of southwest Florida by one conservation group alone. And yet, here's the uncomfortable truth Florida had to face. None of that was close to enough. The Greater Everglades ecosystem sprawls across roughly 7,800 square miles, and biologists estimate the total python population somewhere in the tens of thousands, with some rougher historical estimates running even higher. Pulling a few thousand snakes a year out of an area that size is a bit like trying to bail out a swimming pool with a coffee cup. Pythons are ambush predators. Their camouflage is so effective that even experienced trackers walking directly past a resting python in tall grass will often miss it completely. Estimates suggest that even skilled hunters searching on foot might detect only a small fraction of the pythons actually present in a given area. The state wasn't losing because people weren't trying hard enough. It was losing because the fundamental method, humans walking through wetlands hoping to spot a 15-foot camouflage snake, simply does not scale against an animal this good at not being found. This is where the story stops being a straightforward hire more hunters narrative and starts becoming the part that actually earned Florida the ridicule online. Because the state's next move looked, from the outside, completely bizarre. If you can't find the pythons by searching randomly, why not get the pythons to lead you to each other? Researchers at the University of Florida and the Conservancy of Southwest Florida developed what's become known, somewhat dramatically, as the Scout Snake Program, and in wildlife circles it's often nicknamed the Judas Snake Technique, a reference to using a member of the group to betray the rest. The method works like this. Biologists capture male Burmese pythons, surgically implant small radio or GPS transmitters into their bodies, then release them back into the wild completely unharmed and free to roam. Male pythons in breeding season are relentlessly driven to find females. And it turns out that drive is so strong and so predictable that researchers can simply follow the signal. A single-track male python will often lead biologists directly to a breeding aggregation, sometimes multiple females clustered in one spot, ready to lay eggs numbering in the dozens each. Remove that cluster, and you're not just removing individual snakes. You're erasing hundreds of future pythons before they ever hatch. The results of this program have honestly been remarkable. Individual scout snakes with names like research tracking codes, essentially becoming minor celebrities among biologists, have led teams to dozens of breeding females over the course of a single season. The Conservancy of Southwest Florida has credited its radio tracking program with helping prevent tens of thousands of python eggs from ever hatching, a number far higher than what raw hunter counts alone could achieve. It's a strange, almost science fiction-sounding idea. Turn the enemy's own biology into the trap. And when it got summarized online in a single punchy headline, something like Florida straps trackers to snakes and lets them loose, it inevitably got flattened into something that sounded like mad science, the kind of concept ripe for jokes about Florida man doing it again. But strip away the internet's love of a good punchline, and what you're actually looking at is a genuinely clever, peer-reviewed wildlife management technique. The same basic principle used by conservationists tracking wolves, feral pigs, and other invasive or endangered animals around the world, just applied here to one of the most notoriously difficult-to-find predators on the planet. The Scout Snake Program is only one layer of what's become a surprisingly high-tech, multi-front operation. Because pythons are nearly impossible for the human eye to spot in dense vegetation, researchers have leaned hard into technology that doesn't rely on eyesight at all. Specially trained detection dogs, breeds selected and conditioned specifically to key in on python scent rather than sight, have been used to sniff out snakes hidden in brush that human searchers walked straight past. In trials, scent detection dogs have been shown to locate significantly more pythons per hour of searching than human teams working the same terrain, because a dog's nose doesn't care whether the target is holding perfectly still and blending into dead leaves. On top of the dogs, researchers have experimented with thermal imaging drones that fly over marshland at night, when pythons are most active and when their body heat stands out more clearly against the cooler surrounding vegetation. There have also been pilot projects testing artificial intelligence-assisted camera traps designed to automatically flag python-shaped movement patterns in huge volumes of footage, cutting down the mind-numbing hours biologists would otherwise spend scrubbing through video by hand. None of these tools work perfectly on their own. Dogs get tired. Drones have limited battery life and can struggle under thick tree canopy. AI detection systems still produce false positives. But stacked together, hunters on the ground, scout snakes leading teams to breeding aggregations, dogs sniffing out what eyes miss, and drones scanning terrain no human could safely or efficiently cover, Florida has built something that looks less like a panicked overreaction and a lot more like an actual integrated strategy. So where does the viral, slightly ridiculous-sounding headline about thousands of snake-killing creatures actually come from? It's a classic case of a true, complicated story getting boiled down into a much punchier, much less accurate soundbite as it spreads. There isn't a literal army of specially bred snake-killing animals being airdropped into the Everglades. What actually happened is that the cumulative scale of Florida's python program, thousands of scout snakes and search efforts combined, thousands of pythons physically removed and euthanized, and the broader push to recruit thousands of citizen hunters through the annual Python Challenge, all got mashed together in translation as stories bounced from local wildlife reports to national outlets to social media clips to comment section paraphrasing. Somewhere in that game of telephone, thousands of removal efforts and trackers became thousands of snake-killing creatures released, a headline that sounds like a horror movie premise, but is really a garbled, exaggerated version of a genuinely factual and fairly remarkable conservation program. The internet loves nothing more than a headline that sounds insane, and Florida, fairly or not, has spent years being the state everyone assumes the craziest version of any story about. That reputation did a lot of the heavy lifting in making people believe the wildest possible interpretation of what was actually a careful, scientifically grounded wildlife management strategy. None of that means the program is finished or that the crisis is close to solved. Even with every tool combined, hunters, scout snakes, dogs, drones, and a public hunting competition that draws hundreds of participants every year, researchers are candid that they are nowhere near eliminating the Burmese python from Florida. The honest goal at this point isn't eradication. It's containment and suppression, keeping the population low enough in key conservation areas that native species have a fighting chance to recover, and slowing the snake's northward creep before it can establish itself even further outside South Florida. That northward spread is its own growing concern. Pythons have already been documented well north of their original stronghold, and climate modeling from University of Florida researchers has suggested that under the right conditions, a meaningful portion of the southern United States could theoretically support a python population if the snakes managed to keep expanding their range unchecked. A hard freeze back in 2010 that dropped South Florida temperatures into the 20s briefly knocked back python numbers and slowed their spread, an accidental reminder that cold weather is currently one of the few natural checks these snakes have. But relying on the occasional cold snap isn't a strategy. It's a stopgap, and it's part of why the tracking, detection, and removal programs keep expanding rather than winding down. There's also a very real human cost baked into why Florida has taken this threat so seriously, beyond the ecological data. Cases of pythons escaping captivity and hurting people, including tragic incidents involving young children killed by pet pythons that got loose, helped galvanize political will behind funding these removal programs in the first place. Lawmakers who might otherwise have treated an invasive snake story as a low-priority curiosity instead pushed through licensing programs, hunter funding, and research grants specifically because the danger wasn't purely theoretical or limited to raccoons and rabbits deep in the swamp. That urgency is part of why the Python program has had staying power across multiple governors and legislative sessions, when plenty of other wildlife initiatives quietly lose funding and fade away. It's rare for an invasive species program to become genuinely bipartisan, well-funded, and long-running. But Florida's python fight has managed exactly that, precisely because the stakes were made painfully concrete early on. What makes this whole story worth revisiting isn't just the cool factor of Judah's snakes and thermal drones, although that's genuinely fascinating on its own. It's what the story reveals about how information travels and mutates once it leaves the hands of scientists and lands in front of millions of scrollers looking for something to laugh at or be outraged by for 5 seconds before moving on. A dense, technical, multi-year wildlife management program involving surgically implanted radio trackers, trained detection dogs, drone thermal imaging, and a decade of population ecology research got flattened into Florida released thousands of snake-killing creatures, a phrase that's technically inspired by real events but wildly distorts what those events actually were. The people laughing at the headline weren't wrong to find it funny. It is a strange, almost absurd-sounding premise on its face. But the folks who actually looked past the punchline found something a lot more interesting waiting underneath. A state agency and a group of research scientists solving an extraordinarily difficult problem with genuine ingenuity, turning an invasive predator's own mating instincts into the very tool used to hunt it down. So the next time a headline sounds too wild to be real, especially one with the word Florida in it, it might be worth doing exactly what we just did here. Because more often than not, the truth isn't that the story was made up. It's that the truth was simply better, stranger, and far more impressive than the 3-second version everyone was laughing at. Florida didn't release an army of snake-killing monsters into the Everglades. It built, piece by piece, one of the most inventive invasive species response programs in the country. And it did that using biology, technology, and old-fashioned boots-on-the-ground effort, all aimed at undoing a mess that started decades ago with a handful of pet store sales nobody thought twice about at the time. The joke got the headline right and the story completely wrong. And honestly, that gap between the punchline and the reality might be the most Florida part of this entire saga. If this deep dive into the real story behind the meme surprised you, let us know in the comments which part stunned you most. The Judas snake trick, the thermal drones, or just how badly the original headline twisted the truth. And if you want more stories where the internet's version of events turns out to be nowhere near as wild as what actually happened, stick around, because we've got plenty more of those coming.